This is the lecture on educational placement and the least restrictive environment. My name is Dr. George Giuliani from Hofstra University, and this lecture is going to focus on the appropriate educational placement for a child with a disability and what we're going to call the least restrictive environment. Now, placement decisions for students with disabilities are to be based on an existing IEP, and therefore they must be made after the development of the IEP. And as we've already discussed in the lecture on IEPs, a decision to place a child with a disability prior to developing an IEP upon which to base that decision constitutes a violation of IDEA and can lead to a finding that the decision would not provide the child with a free appropriate public education. So, just to reiterate from the lecture on IEPs, you cannot have a decision based on educational placement for a child until the IEP is in place. You don't decide placement and then build the IEP. That's a procedural violation under IDEA. You build the IEP first, and then based on the needs of the child, based on the goals set, based on what this child needs and what is appropriate, then we determine the educational placement program for that particular child. Now, IDEA contains several requirements governing the location of the educational placement of a child classified in special education. And unless the IEP requires otherwise, the child should be placed in the school where he or she would attend were there no disability. So again, unless the IEP says otherwise, the child with a disability should be educated in the school where he or she would attend were there no disability. Now let's talk about the least restrictive environment. And perhaps most important, the federal law IDEA requires that children with disabilities must be educated with those without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. Again, the maximum extent appropriate. This requirement applies to non-academic activities and extracurricular activities. For example, lunch, recess, as well as academic activities. But the whole premise of the federal law says that children with disabilities must be educated with those without disabilities to the maximum extent that it is appropriate. Now, this requirement that children with disabilities must be educated with those without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate is referred to as the least restrictive environment, or the LRE. And the least restrictive environment is composed of various continuums of placements that range from the least restrictive to the most restrictive. And what we're going to discuss are all the different continuums of placement for children with special needs, or at least the ones that are most commonly seen. Now, the local education agency, or the school district, is required to ensure that a continuum of alternative placements is available to meet the needs of children with disabilities for special education and related services. Under the federal law, these placements are as follows. We have a general education classroom, or the regular classroom. We have what's called an inclusion classroom. We have a resource room. We have a separate classroom. We have a separate school. We have residential facilities. We have hospitalization. And we have homebound instruction. Again, when you look at the continuum of alternative placements, the continuum of placements possible for the child with a disability, it can range from the gen ed classroom to the inclusion classroom to a resource room to a separate classroom to a separate school to a residential facility, hospitalization, or homebound instruction. And we will now address each one of these. Now, as we said, the child with a disability, the least restrictive possible environment would be being educated in the general education classroom, right? I mean, there's no place less restrictive for a child with a disability than to be receiving his or her education the entire day in a general education classroom. But there's also a classroom known as an inclusion classroom. Now, what's interesting is IDEA does not include the term inclusion in its definitions. So consequently, a legal definition is not found in the law. However, inclusion in its broadest meaning implies that students with disabilities are part of the overall school community and should be included in all activities associated with the school. An inclusion classroom refers to the placement of students with disabilities in a general education classroom with peers without disabilities. So in an inclusion classroom, you're going to have a number of children in general education and some students with special education needs or those classified with special education needs. Now, when you look at an inclusion classroom, it may look exactly like the general education classroom. But an inclusion classroom has something very unique to it. An inclusion classroom has two teachers. One of the teachers is the general education teacher, and one is a special education teacher. And both of the teachers co-teach. Remember that word, co-teaching. Co-teaching is a function of the inclusion classroom. The students in the classroom consist of general education students and special education students, and they are taught together. And at times, the classroom will break into groups for small group instruction, and at other times, they may be taught together. And the students in the class are not told which ones have an IEP and which ones do not. The teachers in the classroom help any students who need help. So it's not as if we have segregation within the classroom. It's not like as if we have one classroom but we separate those with special needs and those without special needs. On the contrary, in an inclusion classroom, the students in the classroom consist of gen ed students and special ed students, and they are taught together. There are two teachers, one general ed, one special ed, but ultimately both teachers in the classroom help any students who need the help. And so this term co-teaching refers to when a special education teacher and a general education teacher share the teaching responsibilities for a class, which includes students with and without disabilities. Both teachers are equally responsible for the planning, the delivery of instruction, the grading, IEP implementation, and classroom management for all students. Instruction is enhanced for students when there are two teachers in a room with different areas of expertise. So the general education teacher provides expertise in the content area, while the special education teacher provides expertise in differentiating the instruction. But remember, you have two teachers in the class. They're both working with all the children in the classroom. So when you think of an inclusion classroom, think of co-teaching, the co-teaching model, a general education teacher and a special education teacher, and they're both co-teaching, working in unison to deliver the instruction for grading, for the implementation of the IEP, and for the classroom management of students. Finally, one final issue to note, a controversial issue in terms of inclusion, and that is the concept of full inclusion. Now, full inclusion is not something that we have in the schools today, but it is something that is being spoken about, and you need to be aware of it. Full inclusion is an interpretation of the principle of the least restrictive environment that advocates that all students with disabilities are to be educated in the general education classroom. No matter how severe the disability, no matter what the issue is, all students with disabilities are to be educated in the general education classroom. So it involves the delivery of appropriate specialized services to students with disabilities in a general education classroom. Again, this is not the situation today. We have other types of educational placements for students with disabilities, but the issue of full inclusion, when you hear someone talking about full inclusion, it's an interpretation of this least restrictive environment, referring to the fact that no matter what the disability is, no matter how severe the disability is, all children get educated in the general education classroom. And that ends part 1 of the lecture on least restrictive environment. Please go to part 2.